Here we go. Folks, we are doing the book of Luke. You're not excited at all. You don't even care. You better be, because we're going to be here 2 years, and if you think I'm kidding, I am not. The staff got the breakdown. They're like, literally Tim Maurice was like, really? And I'm like, yeah, 2 years. So it's going to be awesome. So what I want you guys to do is this. Today we're going to do an intro. In this intro, my goal for this intro is to set up who this guy Luke is, parameters of some things. I'm going to give you a little bit of history. I want to show you some kind of cool things about the book of Luke, but I want to share with you, first of all, our phrase that will be the key verse for the whole book, actually. The key for the whole book is Luke chapter 1, verse 4, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. My desire in this series is that you walk out of the book of Luke and you walk out going, I know of the things that I have been taught. And we're going to take it slowly for that very purpose. This will be the first time that I'm doing a gospel, obviously, after coming someplace like Israel. And so it's been so fun to go, I've been there. Like, it's so fun to have a perspective of going to Israel and seeing some of the spots that we're going to be talking about and giving context and all the things that come with that. And so I just want to let you know I'm very excited about this series. One of the things I also want to let you know is we're not going to be like hardcore, like Deuteronomy. People are like, no, I got through Deuteronomy. Does that make sense? I'm going to be much more lax that if we need to take a break and go do some things for a few weeks and then come back, that'll be absolutely fine. Now, your reading plans that you'll pick up are we're booked all the way through the end of the year. We're booked all the way through November. But don't be surprised if we break away from that for something special or something unique. I'm not going to be as connected to that because we're going to be here a long time. And I think there's nothing better than having the background of the gospel just being able to be with us as we go through. Does that make sense? All right. So as we start, I'm just going to read to you the verses we're covering today. We're covering 4 verses. I know that's a lie, but it's going to sound that way at the beginning. Luke chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us, it seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, that you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. Okay, the first four verses of this book give us so much rich information. And it tells us a lot about what is happening and why it's happening, and we're going to break that down right now. So let's go back to the very first verse. Go back to Acts verse 1, verse 1 and 2, I apologize. I want to take you back there because these are connected. So the writer of the book of Luke is Luke, and the writer of the book of Acts is Luke. And so the beginning of the book of Acts says this: in the first book, O Theophilus, I have dealt with all that Jesus began to do and teach. So it gives us a perspective. The first book was, this is what he began to do and began to teach, until the day when he was taken up after he had given commands through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. Okay. So basically, the 2 books are, he's writing to this guy, Theophilus. So we'll get to that in just a second. But the concept is look, the first book was this, and the second book was going to be, hey, how did the church expand after his resurrection? Let's go back to verse 1 of Luke 1 through 4. Inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us. Okay. Luke is not the first one to try to write down the things of Christ. He's not. And we know that because we know we have, of course, 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And it is believed that other people were starting to write down and keep a record of things that were going on. So he goes, look, I know others have sat down to write some things about this person of Jesus Christ. Now, what I'm about to give you is pretty well accepted. It is this idea that you can kind of hold to. The book of Matthew is written by a Jew. His audience is Jewish, and it has a Jewish perspective. The book of Mark is a book written by a Roman from a Roman perspective, and its audience was Roman. And it's interesting, for example, and you can tell the difference. Matthew and Luke deal with, of course, Jesus' birth. Mark doesn't even start with Jesus' birth because a Roman culture could care less about his birth. Does that make sense? So he just picks up right at John the Baptist and off they go. Then you have the book of Luke, which is a Greek author who writes from a Greek perspective to a Greek audience, and we'll get to that much more specifically in a minute. And then you have the book of John, which is the book of love, right? Because he's just this one who loved Jesus, and he writes to the world. I mean, he just writes to everybody. The only problem with John is that John could care less about the order of how things happened. So, for example, when John starts writing his book, he'll take something that happened in the third year of being with Jesus, and then the next sentence go to something that happened in the second year, and then it'll go to something in the first year. Does that make sense? Matthew, Mark, and Luke try to be chronological and try to be able to put things together. This is the beginning towards the end. John could care less. And so with that, we have this idea of the synoptic gospels. I want to show you this graph. And when you first look at it, it's confusing, and I want to point some things out to you, and we'll see some things. Look for the red dot, because here we go. So one thing you'll see here is that this is Mark right here, right? This is Mark, and this is, of course, Luke, and this is Matthew. So what's happening is you'll see in that middle section, it's called the triple tradition, meaning what is in the book of Mark, what is in the book of Luke, and what is in the book of Matthew. Well, you would assume there would be the same stories because they're all talking about the same person. Does that make sense? So you can see 76% of what is in Mark, you will find that book, 41% of that becomes into Luke, and 45% becomes into Matthew. You will see over here in this little gray dot over here, you'll say, okay, between Mark and Luke, how many of them are just between those two, which means Matthew doesn't speak about it. 3% in Mark and 1% in Luke. Over here on this red dot, what's between Mark and Matthew that is only between them and not done in Luke? And again, 10% of that is in Matthew and 18% of that is in Mark. Now, you will notice in each section, watch this, in the book of Luke, what is unique to Luke? You'll find it right here in this little red dot. 35% of the book of Luke is unique to Luke, meaning Matthew nor Mark speak about it. Well, how do we know that would be significant? Because we get most of the birth story from the book of Luke. We get some details that are only found in the book of Luke. And of course, and you can see over here, and what is only of Matthew, 20% is only found in Matthew, has something that the other two books don't have. But notice this, unique to Mark, only 3%, which is right up here. And the reason why is Mark was the first book written of the three Gospels, and they believe, of course, there'd be more copying from Luke and or Matthew from the book of Mark. But the other thing about that is that Mark truly kind of stays with all the big stories. Does that make sense? He doesn't go off the beaten path very much. So therefore, it would be obvious that you would kind of duplicate. And then, of course, this blue section at the bottom, this is where, again, what's connected only between Luke and Matthew, and that connection is there, and you can see the percentages as they go through. So the reason why I'm showing you this graph is I think it just kind of illustrates, here is these different books. They obviously have purposes and perspectives, and we, of course, are looking at this guy, Luke. And interesting enough, what happens with Luke is that he does something unique. So let's jump into it, okay? So in this, in verse 2, we have, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses, very important, and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. So let me use this illustration. If I was to tell of a story, let's take something very simple. Let's talk about a kid's birthday party. Now, what's funny about it is if I said, okay, I'm going to have 4 authors there. One author, I want them to write the story about this kid's birthday party from the grandparents' perspective. I want someone else to write the story of this birthday party from the parents' perspective. I want the third person to write the story from the kids' perspective. And the fourth one, I want them to write it from the actual birthday person's perspective. Would you get 4 unique stories about that birthday party? Everyone's there, everyone's seeing the same thing, and yet those 4 perspectives, you're going to get something from a kid's perspective that obviously maybe the grandparents didn't care about, right? Kids are all about the cake, and right, and the grandparents are like, the kids were all together, and they were having fun, and oh, and they liked my gift, and the other kids are like, it was cake, and there was right? So in this, Luke does a couple of things that the other three writers do not do. What we believe is that Matthew and Mark, Matthew, by the way, would have been an eyewitness. Mark, by the way, his mentor is Peter, so almost everything he's getting is coming from Peter, right? And John is an eyewitness. Luke is over here going, I came on after the scene, but Luke did something. He tied his hands in this one way. I will not write about it unless I talk to someone who was there. Does that make sense? Eyewitness. I went. So interesting enough, why do we have more of the birth story in the book of Luke than the rest of them? Because Luke went and found Mary. Luke went and found Elizabeth. Luke went and found Zechariah. So what we have is there are times when you're reading the book of Luke where you're going, well, what should happen is this, but Luke doesn't talk about it. Why doesn't he talk about it? Because he could not find an eyewitness. Does that make sense? And he in his world is going, Mark has Peter's perspective, John has his perspective, Matthew has his perspective, but I will only write it down. And here's why. He says in here, eyewitnesses delivered them to us. Meaning, as he was with Paul, he would come into towns, and if there was anyone who saw what happened, he would go interview them. And if he could not find, if it became second, third, he did not put it in. Here's what's next. Verse 3. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. Because he knows who Theophilus is, he knows that if he goes off on anything that cannot be proven, it's done. Does that make sense? So, for those of you that are a part of our inmates group, and for those of you that are reading the book Seven Great Men, one of the things that's interesting about Dietrich Bonhoeffer is they talk about the fact that in his family, if you were to bring up a topic at the table, you better be ready to defend it because the entire family attacked your topic and said to see whether or not you could really back it up or not. Does that make sense? Can you imagine sitting at that table? Anything you brought up, you couldn't just be like, well, I think, right? My first year in Bible college, I walked in to a class called Dr. Mont Smith. Dr. Mont Smith was a legend in his own time, and we think in his own mind. The man was brilliantly crazy. Does that make sense? Brilliantly crazy. He wore a fanny pack. I loved him. He one time came into class, I kid you not, walked in, said shalom, turned around, and did his entire lecture to the backboard. We're all looking at each other, and he's saying great stuff. We're like, started taking notes. Gets done with his entire lecture, turns around and goes, some of you will have senior pastors that will be like talking to a chalkboard, but they're still speaking the word of God, and you better learn how to learn from them. Thank you, and he walked out. Okay. So Mont Smith, though, he waited. You could tell there were like three things. He waited you to wear a hat inside of his classroom. I did it. What was so funny is I knew it was going to come, and I forgot I was wearing a hat. And I'm like, and you could tell because he was like, someone seems to think they should be able to wear a hat. And I forgot I was wearing it. I'm like, oh, someone's getting busted. This is going to be awesome. And I'm like looking around, and I'm not catching the hint that he's coming to my side. I'm like, someone around me, I don't see anyone else wearing a hat. What? Yeah, okay, I was one, okay. Oh, yeah, so Ethan, yes. Second thing, wow. Second thing, he waited. You could tell he had his ears trained for this sentence. Well, my pastor says, and he would pounce. Is your pastor in this class? Is your pastor here to defend what he said? Or are you going to try to defend the pastor? Because obviously you were there when he studied and you know all the things. Because if you're going to do that, then let's get him in here. I mean, he would go off and you're like, whoa. And that moment you learn, he goes, if you're going to be in this class, you better be able to stand on your own 2 feet biblically and be able to defend your position. And my pastor said, does not pass. So with that attitude, Luke comes in and goes, if I'm going to say it, I'm going to be able to say, I talked to him, I know it, I got perspective, I know what I'm saying. Does that make sense? So when he says to this, look, and to this Theophilus, well, what do we know about this Theophilus? We believe that he was a Greek, obviously from a Greek perspective, who, by the way, had been taught of God, but was questioning whether or not this really could be of God. By the way, whether you get it or not, the story of Jesus coming down from heaven as a baby to then die for our sins, raise again, and to give us eternal life is pretty much a radical story. It's a little crazy. And so Luke is saying, I'm going to give you an orderly account. Because look what he says. That you may have what? Certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. Certainty. That Theophilus, if it's in this book, my reputation is behind it. So what's great about the book of Luke is that when you read something, you can know that he found out. And he cross-checked it. And he did it twice. Now, we know something else about him, Colossians 4:14. Luke, the beloved physician, greets you, as does Demas. So this is an educated man. Now, I'm going to tell you right now, I've met a lot of doctors. Most doctors, although you feel like they're guessing in the waiting in the room, most of them do not like to guess. And if they're guessing, it's usually what we call an educated guess. And so him to be a physician, by the way, at this time, a Greek physician nonetheless, meant that he had studied under some of the greatest schools. To be a physician is not to be in the see the thing as a doctor. There's a level to that word. And so you have in this guy who came to be a follower of Jesus Christ, and in this goes, but it's got to make sense to me. Now, here's what's interesting. I love this about the spread of this room. Some of you, and I'm not going to look at certain people, because if I look at certain people, you're going to think I'm talking about you, and I probably am, but I'm not. The idea is, some of you are really into your head, meaning, man, this has got to, Corey Divers, be really important to me in my head. Which means it has got to make sense up here. By the way, I have had few people other than Corey Divers who would literally come after me and go, you're not slipping anything past me. I heard what you said. Back it up. And then he married another person, Michelle Divers, who, by the way, has the same attitude. God, I hated when they came. Anyway, so the idea is there is a part of you, and by the way, and there's some of you like, it honestly is me. Oh, that's okay. That's what he said. Woo! I believe it, right? And we're on this spectrum. And you have in Luke going, look, I'm going here. I need everyone who reads this to know that this is what's going on. Because honestly, most of the conversion process was happening person to person. I met Jesus. This is my conversion story. This is going on. And you all have been there. And if somebody asks you a question, you get locked up, right? I don't know. I just know it's true. Which, by the way, is a perfectly good answer. But your answer should be, I don't know, but I can find out. Or I don't know, but the Word of God tells us, and let's find out together. And by the way, you can also say, and by the way, the Word gives us some freedom, and we don't all have to agree on every single point, but we have to agree on the important points. And the important points definitely are in the book of Luke. Okay. Next thing is this, Philemon 23:24. There's no chapter Philemon because there's only one chapter. Philemon 23 and 24. Epaphras, my fellow prisoner in Christ Jesus, sends greetings to you. And so do Mark, Aristarchus, Demas, and Luke, my fellow workers. Now, the reason why that verse becomes important is because, by the way, this verse 24 is weighted with stuff. Why is it important that Mark is talked about by Paul? Well, Mark was the one that, remember, was with Paul, dished Paul, and Barnabas was the one that said, hey, I think Mark should come with us again. Paul goes, absolutely not. He dished me once. I'm not taking him again. And they had a strong debate, and one took one, and one took the other. Barnabas took Mark, and then Paul took Silas. And in this time, now we have what? Mark back with Paul. But we also see something else. This guy Demas, who's already been spoken of, and Luke. Now, the book of Philemon is written more towards the end of Paul's life. And you have, by the way, a knowledge that Luke came along, by the way, most likely in the middle of Paul's second missionary journey. Meaning that all of a sudden, Luke becomes what we call a companion. And the reason why we know that is Acts chapter 16, verse 10. Out of nowhere, we're 16 chapters into the book of Acts, and we read this. And when Paul had seen the vision, immediately we sought to go into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. So from the 16th chapter on, Luke is a part of the we story. And when you get to the other books, you find out that Luke stays with Paul. As a matter of fact, many times, Luke is the one there taking care of Paul. And in this process, what you have in Luke is this guy who is in honestly, all in. Now, let me give you something that is interesting. Now, by the way, what I'm about to tell you, I will be forthright in telling you. When you try to date the book of Luke, you can say it could be as early as the 60 AD all the way to 80 AD. It's a pretty big span. And by the way, if you read theologians, they'll all attack it from different angles and why and how come and everything else. The common belief is it was written somewhere between 60 and 65 AD. Well, where would that have been? It would have been right after Paul was arrested and was put into jail at Rome. Because basically, when he went under house arrest, there wasn't a lot of travel to them. So they believe that what is happening is that before the writing of the book of Titus and before the writing of 2 Timothy, Luke writes the book of Luke. Okay? Because again, he met this Theophilus, spoke with him, sees that there's other books. He knows that Mark has written a book. Because, by the way, he was with Mark. Does that make sense? So he goes, I know Mark wrote a book. But here's the problem. He's a Greek, and he knows Mark, and where did Mark start off at? John the Baptist. And Luke's going, there's a problem here. Let's go back. So notice we start with, he goes, other people have. Well, he knows that Mark has, and by the time, he knows that Matthew has. But he's saying this, but no one has written from this perspective. Let's go back to our birthday party. So someone wrote grandma's perspective, and someone wrote the kid's perspective, but who wrote the parent's perspective? You know what I'm saying? That's the question. So when he writes to Theophilus, he's going, I want to make sure I speak in a way that a Greek would understand what was being talked about. Now, for those of you that know Greek or understand the concept of Greece, what is the Greek really about? Just give me, you can all yell out, what are the Greeks really about? What? Body. Someone said body, excellent. That's where we get the Olympics from. Anyone else? Philosophy, excellent. Socrates, what? Okay. What? Government. Family. Perfection. So you have to understand the Greeks are trying to create, by Alexander the Great, the perfect man. That's their goal. So what do? We do Olympics, and we try to be physically perfect, and we have Socrates and Aristotle. We try to be mentally perfect, and we try to be socially perfect, which is why they had their whole social system and their government system, and they had their law system. So interesting enough, if you're going to win a Greek over with this person who is Jesus, who, by the way, is not Greek, but by the way, is a Jew, you're going to have to put Jesus into a light that a Greek would go, but is he? And by the way, in the book of Luke, you're going to find out that Luke does the absolute best job of showing that Jesus is the perfect man. The perfect man. That how he loved and what he did and the wisdom that he uses. So you're going to hear phrases that are very Greek-minded because they're trying to reach to this place where they go, now you're speaking my language. Now, by the way, I don't know if you guys know this, but advertisers, do you know what the average age that an advertiser is trying to reach? Does anyone know? What? Thank you. He just hit it. 12. You know why? Because old people want to be 12 again. Do you remember that 12 before you became 13 and went stupid? Right? When things were simpler and it was just all about playing outside and everything else. If they can make you capture that feeling, they've done a great job. And a lot of the things they're pushing on in advertising is trying to get you to that feeling of back of innocence and wonder, and it could happen. Because when you were 12, you could own any car you wanted to own. When you were 12, you could be anything you wanted to be. So know that, interesting enough, our marketing people know how to write things to speak, to touch certain triggers in who we are. Luke knows that to reach into the Greek culture, he is going to have to understand and explain this Jesus Christ in a way that they're going to be like, I get that. That's what we get to do. Now, why do some of you guys know that the first gospel I chose to go through was Mark. I believe as a culture, we are more like the Roman culture than we are a Greek culture. I don't care how educated we want to be. I don't care how beautiful we want to be. We like power. And that's what the Roman culture was about. Power and strength and dominance. But second to it is this concept of beauty and knowledge and wisdom and places that we worship in that way. And so I think Luke does apply to our society, and I think it's going to be an incredible journey for us to see what was God saying to that culture and what does he say to you. 2 Timothy 4, 9 through 12. This is a sad part of this story. We're at the end of Paul's life. By the way, at the end of the book of 2 Timothy, he says he knows that his life is coming to an end. He realizes he's going to be poured out as a drink offering. He says, do your best to come to me soon. He's writing to Timothy at this moment. For Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me. Demas, who is mentioned over and over again, Luke and Demas, Luke and Demas, Luke and Demas, are always with Paul, and it starts off with, for Demas, in love with this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia. Titus to Dalmatia. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful for me in ministry. And Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. Here is Paul at the end of his life, men who have stood in the trenches with him. And by the way, I want to say something to you. Luke stayed to the end. He alone stood by Paul as he was about to face his death. But Demas had run off because he loved this world. Folks, I don't care how old you are. I don't care how much you think you got this thing beat. Please understand this world calls to you at all times and wants to, as we preached when we did Fixed, cut in on you and take you off your game. And you're going, Demas, I mean, what do we do? How does that happen? Demas, Paul would have known if he was a follower of Christ or not. Yes, Paul would have known if Demas, but what happened was Demas loved this world more. And we need to be aware of our own hearts. Because it doesn't matter what age. We can lose sight and lose focus. And before we know it, we're not where we want to be. Luke 1, verse 4. That you may have certainty concerning the things that you have been taught. My goal in this series is to have you come away going, I am certain of this Christ I follow, his word that he has given me, and the way in which he has called me to live. And my desire is to buttress you up, strengthen you, foundation, and literally put on your feet strength to stand because God's word is true. True, no matter what. That is my prayer for you. That is my hope for you for the next 2 years. It's going to be fun. Next week it goes. Aren't you excited? We get to have Christmas here through the whole month of June. It's the Christmas story, the whole month of June. We're going to sing Christmas carols, I'm almost positive. Because how do you do this book and not bring out a couple of Christmas carols? Does that make sense? It's going to be awesome. But my desire for you is to fall in love with God's word. When you come out of this, to say, wow, it's not what my pastor said. It's what God's word says. And it's where I stand. And it's where I'm not moved. Let me pray for you. Heavenly Father, I thank you for today. I want to thank you for the gift of last weekend. I want to thank you for Discovery, for letting us come over and use their facilities. What a blessing that was to know that our church was well taken care of in their care. Father, I want to thank you for the fact that there are 3 families who are right now decorating their new homes. Father, I want to thank you for the fact that you have called us to be your children, and that, Father, you gave us Luke, this great physician, this one that would say, if I'm going to write this down, I'm going to know it's true because I will not put it out unless it is. Father, would you give us the strength to know your word? Would you give us the strength to walk in it? Protect this church. Protect its children. And I love this leadership and the strength that they have in you. I pray all these things because your Son is incredibly mighty and incredibly gracious and incredibly beautiful. And it is in his name we pray. Amen.